Welcome back. We're, I think, now in the home stretch of today's meeting. What we have to do between now and the close of the meeting today is the second part of the Human Rights Technical Committee recommendations, and then we'll be looking at the Universal Standards project that's been proposed, as discussed. So I'll start just by turning it back to Laura for the second part of the human rights recommendations, please.
Thank you. And before moving on, just an invitation to GSSB members to send any further comments on the disclosures to us by email until Friday, the 19th of April. And we will then look to collate all of the comments and bring them back to the technical committee. So the next topic for discussion is the implications for reporting principles and terminology emerging from this work. The technical committee looked at the reporting principles for defining report content, and in particular materiality, to see if they could be aligned more closely with the expectations and the core concepts in the main instruments, the guiding principles and the OECD, not only to make them more suitable in the context of human rights, but also to acknowledge that these principles have redefined the field of responsible business conduct, and that some changes may be needed to make the reporting principles more consistent with those expectations. The committee flagged a number of issues with the practical application of materiality, which they thought were of particular concern in the context of human rights, and possibly part of why there is so little reporting on human rights currently. They are listed in item 7, but some examples of the challenges that they flagged are that materiality assessments often focus on the risks to the business as opposed to risks to people, that companies often focus on the top right quadrant of the materiality matrix, thereby omitting significant impacts if these are not also highlighted by stakeholders, and also that the perspective of affected and potentially affected stakeholders are often not considered in these assessments. So with that in mind, the committee has made a number of recommendations to revise the reporting principles, and they include aligning the definition of stakeholder with that used in the OECD, which is persons or groups who have interests that are or could be impacted by an enterprise's activities. They've also recommended making impact the primary consideration in a materiality assessment over and above the opinions and views of stakeholders. So in this case, an organization would start by looking at its impacts and determining which are significant, as informed by the perspectives of affected and potentially affected stakeholders, and then it would test and look for any omissions with the more policy or expert type of stakeholders. They've also recommended aligning the definition of significant impact with that in the OECD, which defines significance as the combination of severity and likelihood, with severity being defined as the scale, scope, and irremediable character of an impact. And in the context of human rights, the emphasis will be on severity compared to likelihood. And finally, they have recommended to emphasize certain elements that are often overlooked in materiality assessments and which are important in the context of human rights. And that includes this focus on risks to people and to the environment, looking at potential impacts in addition to actual impacts, looking at the impacts through business relationships and not just the direct impacts of a company's operations, and taking into account the perspectives of affected stakeholders in addition to the views of the more policy and expert type of stakeholders, which are the stakeholders that are commonly consulted in materiality assessments. The committee also looked at the terminology used in the standards and how that compares with that used in the main instruments, and they have made a number of suggestions. ultimately, the committee, there were different views as to which terms would be more suitable in this context, but what they recommended is that the guidance of the standards explicitly explains all of the different terms that exist, how they relate to each other, and which ones are used by GRI to help reduce the confusion among reporters, especially for reporters that will be using various instruments and reporting frameworks in conjunction. So the suggestions that they have made are to use issue rather than topic, negative rather than adverse, potential negative impact rather than risk, and if risk is to be used in the GRI standards, it has to be very carefully explained so that it is not confused with risks to the business. And finally, to use impact cause, contributed to and directly linked, rather than direct and indirect impact as used in the GRI standards. Finally, the committee also discussed the use of the term salient human rights, and this is also one area where GSSB members wanted to know a bit more about. And by way of context, none of the main instruments, so the guiding principles and the OECD, use the term salient. So it's not used in the guiding principles, and it is not used in the OECD M&E guidelines or in the latest due diligence guidance. The term was first introduced in the interpretative guide to the UN guiding principles, and it was then later popularized by the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework, which was developed by Shift and Mazars. The committee did, though, discuss the potential use of this term in the standards and how that relates to materiality. And the difficulty in the discussion was that there are two definitions and two understandings of salience in the expert community. So one understanding of salience is that those are the issues that are most likely for a company, given its context and activities. So they are the issues that stand out and that are important just because a company happens to engage in a certain activity. So to give you an example, for a mining company, the rights of indigenous peoples may be considered to be a salient issue. The other understanding of salient is those issues that the company has prioritized through a process based on severity. So following on the same example, rights of indigenous peoples may be a salient issue for a mining company, but that mining company may or may not prioritize that issue for action or for reporting. So those are the two nuances that exist with regards to salience. In addition to that, there were different views in the committee as to the value of introducing a new term in the standards. Some thought that it could help shift people's thinking towards risks to people, but others thought that it would just add to the confusion in this area. However, and the important thing, I think, in this discussion is that the committee thought that both notions of salience are relevant to be captured in the GRI disclosures. And this is how they did that in Disclosure 5. So if you look at Disclosure 5, it asks about the material human rights topics and how those topics were identified. So in the identification part, there are 4 sub-requirements, and these look at how the impacts were identified, how the material topics were then prioritized based on an assessment of the severity and likelihood of those impacts, the experts and stakeholders consulted, particularly affected and potentially affected stakeholders, and the last one, why any human rights topics that are commonly associated with the types of activities the organization carries out or with the context in which these activities take place have not been identified as material. So requirements B2 and B4 here represent these two notions of salience, and this is the way the committee was able to address this issue. So I want to spend some time explaining the last requirement, because there have been some concerns from GSSB members as to the value of such disclosure. So this requirement essentially looks at whether the company recognizes the inherent human rights risks in its activities. The example we have included in guidance is that of a mining company and the topic of rights of indigenous peoples. So a mining company may be expected in the early stages of due diligence to look at the topic of rights of indigenous peoples to see if it may have a negative impact on those rights. So in the case that, let's say, the company does not have any impacts on the rights of indigenous peoples because, for example, it does not operate in any areas inhabited by indigenous peoples, the company would still be expected, as per this disclosure, to explain that, to indicate that this risk has not been overlooked. So in other words, this is trying to show whether the company has done its due diligence to see if the rights of indigenous peoples could be potentially negatively impacted by its activities, even if that topic has eventually not been prioritized as a material topic by the company. In addition, in the guidance to Disclosure 5, we have added a little text to explain the different terms used in GRI, the OECD, and the UN Guiding Principles to show how they relate to each other. So we will come to that in a moment, but I would propose next steps to move this forward as explained in the project proposal for the universal standards is that we look at testing the proposed changes to the reporting principles through expert interviews and stakeholder consultations as part of the review of the universal standards, and that we also look to identify any other additional changes that the GSSB may want to make to the reporting principle based on additional research and engagement, so that we not only look at this from the perspective of human rights, but we look at the whole range of changes that may be needed to update and improve the application of the reporting principles. So with that, there's two items for discussion here. One is to see if there are any questions or concerns from GSSB members on the proposed recommendations to revise the reporting principles. There were some concerns raised already by one GSSB member as to whether it is a priority of the GSSB to look into the reporting principles at this stage. And secondly, to look at the last requirement in Disclosure 5, as some questions have been raised around the feasibility and value of asking companies for this information.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, I'll open up the discussion. Michel.
Yes, a very fast question. When I read the report, is there a reference list of human rights related topics?
So we refer to the internationally recognized human rights that are listed in the main instruments, so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various conventions through which those are declinated, and the ILO core conventions. And we simply paraphrase the guidance included in the UN Guiding Principles on that topic. And I believe it's covered in the background context to the disclosures.
I was asking the question mainly because it's been a topic in our organization. Where do human rights begin? Where do they stop? And at some points, because we couldn't find one exhaustive reference list, we just said, okay, this is what we're going to consider. But since topics are referenced so much within the within the document submitted here. If there was a link to a reference list, it would help.
Okay, Evan.
Well, two comments. I'll take the second one first. I agree with Michelle in a different way that the vagueness of number 2 to me is the part that I have an issue with. Who defines which human rights topics are commonly associated with different types of activities the organization might be involved with? I hear this from companies all the time. You know, we are expected to report on X, Y, and Z, but nobody tells me what X, Y, and Z are. So I think that the way that we've worded this, maybe to avoid the term salience, or maybe to get at a different meaning or a different interpretation, is leaving a lot of room for companies to just scratch their head and not really understand what the expectation is. And then I take your point on salience being a confusing term in the space, especially in contrast with materiality, which is also confusing in the space for a lot of people too. But it is used in a lot of business contexts when you talk about human rights. A lot of businesses, rightly or wrongly, use it to differentiate the impacts of the organization on human rights beyond the business impact and looking at things that are societal or cultural. So I'm glad you included it in the appendix, or you at least included it as a term that is out there in the universe, but it does come up quite often in a human rights context when I have business discussions.
I'm first of all just going to welcome Tony Moe to the table. It's awfully glad to have you here with us today. I hope you're not too tired from your very long journey. Welcome. Okay, Dwight and then Kirsten.
I was going to supplement some of what Laura said based on the discussions in the technical committee, and so I'm just going to go through some of the points that were made in the first slides. One was I was going to talk about the definition of stakeholder and then of risk and salient and tell you what went on in the committee that way. But the evidence that I did something horribly wrong in a previous life is shown by the fact that I spent a lot of years with the ISO and their social responsibility standard, and of which Peter was part of, and some other things. And there was a long 4-year discussion over the meaning of stakeholder. Now, what the issue was this. In the original introduction of the term into this discourse was done in the 1980s, and the idea was to sort of show in the context of corporate governance that you needed to have more input from people other than the board and people interested in the company. And the argument was that these are people that you can affect, but also these are people you need to talk to because they can get to you. So then the unfortunate definition became people that can affect or be that people can be affected by or can affect the company. The problem is that the understanding of the word stakeholder, where stake is not, the stakeholder isn't the one that holds the winnings for the people gambling. The stakeholder, stake in this sense means the one that has the interest that can be shown to, they have the interest in the activities of the organization. So theoretically anyway, if you have ones that can be affected by and then can affect, you can theoretically have stakeless stakeholders. And this is conceptually flawed, to say the least, and also it doesn't help in developing the thinking, because if you want to you have to start out realizing that stakeholders have different interests. Some of those interests are more important than others, that some of them are not always relevant to what the subject is or this or that. So you have to have a measurement of a stakeholder. That measurement is the stake. So what is the interest that we are dealing with here? And so you really can't have stakeless stakeholders. And that silly definition, it's time to get rid of it. The OECD doesn't use it. After 4 years of discussion, believe it or not, the ISO decided not to use it, at least in their social responsibility standard, and it just isn't conducive to thought. I mean, so basically, there are people that businesses need to talk to get something done. And that might be people that can affect them that aren't affected by them. But, for instance, the press or maybe somebody else. But in the context of what is being discussed here, a stakeholder has to have a stake. I mean, it's that simple. And it just it's like some of the thinking with some of the thinking with responsibility, where responsibility doesn't mean responsibility, it means voluntary, so that's part of it. Now, the materiality discussion, that's another issue, but I'm not going to discuss that right now because that's something you'll have to deal with later. The risk issue, I've already mentioned when I first spoke about that. The problem is there is a management context of risk and opportunity that is not the same as what's mentioned in the public, what's understood in the principles and this and that, and it gets back to this notion of materiality, because if you're following accounting principles, materiality relates to the company. If you're following responsibility principles, materiality relates to the effect of the company on others. So the question of risk, the risk in this context is meant in that second thing. Now, one of the things that was really impressive about the technical committee was, and if you recall the remit and the approval process, the people that were on this technical committee, some of them actually worked with Professor Ruggie in developing the guiding principles. All of them had extensive experience with the guiding principles. These were not people who were sort of representing a group interest. These were people that, while they came from different stakeholders, they also understood the guiding principles, and there's no discussion of that. But what happens is when you get some of these experts like this that are truly experts, some of the discussions became somewhat theological. And by that I mean these were people who were committed to the guiding principles and very familiar with them. And so we had some very long discussions over, for instance, saliency. And as Laura mentioned, saliency appears in the interpretive guide, and then it appears in a slightly different version in the UN reporting framework. The first version, without a definition, seems to be referred to as likely and common to the sector, common to the context, this and that. And the other is basically a step further in the process of due diligence, where you've actually identified things that are severe. So that second version depends a little bit on some work done in advance, which is where do you start due diligence. So if you look at the that fourth point, B4, it says why any human that are commonly associated with the types of activities of the organization carries out. If you go to the OECD due diligence guidance, there is a fairly extensive discussion in the first part and the second part about common risks, high-level risks, risks that are common to the sector and the enterprise-level risks and context-level risks. These are places to begin. And so what you see here is actually an order where 4 would inform the B4 would inform the development of A1. So what they're doing is, in A1, they're actually, you report on something based on severity that you've prioritized. But what if, for instance, you examine something that was common or expected of the activity or the context, and you decided it wasn't important? Well, they're saying in 4, well, what was, there's something that you decided wasn't important, mention what you decided wasn't important and say why. Now, the committee liked this version. Privately, I prefer the other way. I would prefer all the common risks to be stated and then to look at the ones that were most severe for action. But you can do it the other way, which is what's happening here. But basically looking at A1 and B4, think of it mainly as a step process. The step 1 is to look at all the common risks, and step 2 is to prioritize the severe ones. But you can You can report on it, this or that. But the saliency thing, I was very taken by the interpretive guide, and I liked the term. And at the OECD, when they were developing the due diligence guidance, I recommend saliency. And the OECD decided not to, and part of the reason was businesses, among others, complain that we don't need things with a new term. And so they decided there wasn't a need for a new term. They preferred significant, and significant in the OECD context is a mix of likely and severity. And then within the OECD, they then go on to talk about prioritizing in the context of severity, but they don't talk about that in terms of the early stages of due diligence. So there's that. Then, okay. Yes, I think that was it. The materiality thing, one of the debates about materiality was whether saliency and materiality could be substituted for each other, where you use the word saliency in the context of human rights and materiality and everything else. Now, the problem with that was that materiality is a reporting concept common to all forms of reporting, whether it's in law or accounting or anything else. And the exact meaning of materiality is relevant here as it is with any other form of a report. So why change the word in that sense? But the reason there was an interest in changing the word, I think, was because some people feel that materiality as a term has been captured to only mean things that are about the organization itself, the reporting organization, and not on another subject. But the thing there is very simple. The purpose of the report determines the materiality. It's not the other way around. So what is material to a sustainability report ought to be what is material to sustainable development, not something else. So the use of the word materiality as put forth in the GRI and so far and defined, and this was dealt with extensively in the transition to standards discussion, is basically right. The problem is you have a lot of companies and a lot of investors and other users of reports that are very influenced by one version of the word materiality, but that materiality doesn't match with the purpose of a sustainability report of the kind GRI does, and so that's the problem there. So I think that that has to be kept in mind. And then in the definition of materiality, when under the G4 process, where we were taking a step towards the concepts that you see in the guiding principles about impacts, that was where the impact dimension was added to materiality. But people who resisted changing the definition of materiality then took the notion of the report reader as being the measure of materiality, which is the accounting practice in the accounting industry. The trouble is you can't really use that. And the reason is there's a lot of stakeholders who are impacted by the company, and there's also a lot of things that are not readers of the report. And that's a very important, and they never will be, and it would be unreasonable to expect them to read the report. So you can't set a criteria for reporting based solely on the people who read the report when you know in advance that you're going to be talking about things that the readers about people that are not going to read the report. And then the other thing is you can say, well, that's all right. All of this is subsumed under reputation risk. And again, materiality is going to have to, if it's sustainable development, it's sustainable development. It's not reputation. So you can't set up a criteria and then the company says, well, nobody's going to know, so we don't have to report. Well, again, you have to have a basis of what a sustainable development report is, and that can't be the measure. Is you can't switch and make reputation risk the criteria for what goes in. So there's two reasons why they're recommending materiality be focused on that first thing and to get rid of this reader thing, because it's not a good idea.
Kirsten.
Well, for those of you who participated when we were reviewing or when we were establishing the standards might remember that I'm not a big fan of the word salience. So I'm very happy about the approach in the draft. Well, what is it called actually? No, it's in the recommendations from the technical committee. When Laura went through 5B, 1 to 4, I suddenly understood what was meant by 4. And I think it's a very good explanation altogether, 1 to 4, on why we are doing it and how we should do it. At the same time, if you only read B4, it's still very, very challenging to understand the background and what is really expected there. So I still believe that we really have to think through what we want to achieve by B4 and how we should achieve, or what we should do to really achieve it. When it comes to other words that are suggested changed, I think we really have to think carefully through it. But there is one I feel that I'm just jumping in my chair when I hear to change topic with issue. We were through a significant process for the standards. Getting rid of aspects which nobody or almost nobody understood what was. Getting into topics which, generally speaking, has been very well received and that most people can relate to. Why issue should be so much better than topic, I don't really understand it, especially for everyone that has been have been watching The Crown or The Young Victoria and have been reading about their ancestors and understood that issue could also be child. So for me, issue is a very mixed word that we should be careful about using that in this context.
Kent.
I wanted to sort of pursue this issue about, what's wrong with the definition of materiality. I guess what my cynicism is, I'm an accountant, as most of you know, and they were discussing materiality and financial reporting long before I was born, and they'll be discussing it long after I die, and so we can discuss it forever. And it's not a bad thing to have the discussion, but I hate for it to take up valuable time that we might be doing something else. But my question is, and it was hard to tell from what Dwight was saying, is it a problem with the definition, or is it the problem with what people have decided already that materiality is? That is this really something that we need to change, or is this just something where we need to do more education? And I guess, because I'm afraid that we could change the words in there, but people have decided what materiality is, and absent that education, it's not really going to change, how they decide to interpret it. And so I'm a little concerned that we change a couple words, we expect something, but the people that we really want to change are the people that really aren't reading the definition anyway. And I don't know if that really moves us forward. So.
Laura, can you just help me out slightly on this slide here, which is for those listening in audio land, the suggestions related to the terminology, where the technical committee has suggested swapping out certain terms for other terms. The following slide, there's also this guidance box, which left me very confused. Could you explain the status of that box over there? Is that proposed guidance to be included? So if you were to look at the previous slide, where they've suggested using the word issue and not the word topic, using the word potential negative impact rather than risk, but then you also see the next slide and you see this guidance box. And the implication of this is that material is the same thing as significant, is the same thing as salient. Topics is the same thing as risks. I find it really kind of messy and borderline buzzword bingo, really. I mean, I'd be very careful about sort of positing options for different concepts that are, you know, take your pick, whichever of these 3 or 4 or 5 different words you like, just substitute them in. When in fact, I think we're quite agreed that salient is very much related to materiality and vice versa, but that they're not interchangeable. They're not exactly the same thing. So I'd be really careful about that. And I wanted to know, you know, how that kind of proposal sort of came through in the discussion was, and how we should read that as the GSSB.
Sure. So Disclosure 5 has been drafted using the existing terminology in the GRI standards. So material, topic, and in the OECD and in the UN Guiding Principles reporting framework, they don't use either of those 2 words, but they do cover this concept. And what's common across this disclosure, the OECD, and the UN reporting framework is the methodology to arrive at those topics, which is severity and then likelihood. So that's the commonality between the 3 terms. It is just that they are used differently in all of these instruments. And we know that there will be a lot of companies that come from the reporting framework, others come from the OECD, and they will want to know how all of these terms relate to each other and if they mean the same thing or not. So the aim of this guidance was to clarify that all of these 3 concepts are aiming at the same thing, which is to single out the most severe human rights impacts. Is that clear?
In a sense, yes. But I think it leaves something fundamental kind of unresolved about the discussion. But I do appreciate that the sort of commonality here is the methodology. I had another question, which had to do with this 5B4. Why topics commonly associated have not been identified as material. Is there not an earlier step requirement that's implied there, which is to state what those are, to identify and to say these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things are commonly associated with the type of activities that we carry out because of, presumably there you'd have to reference it, and here's why or why not we've identified these as material. And I suppose if that's the implicit previous step, should that not be made explicit?
Thank you. So that was discussed by the committee, and it was actually in one of the drafts that we mocked up. There was explicit question at the beginning as to what are those common risks, but the consensus in the committee was that that would be too burdensome for companies to have to state essentially 2 lists of human rights issues, those that are commonly associated to the company, and then those that the company has prioritized based on severity. So that was the compromise to ensure that both concepts are covered, but in a way that it is feasible for companies and where the focus is really on the most severe impacts prioritized by the company. If this is found potentially unclear and confusing, we can take this feedback back to the technical committee to see if there could be another way of presenting the information.
Evan.
Just picking up on Kent's comment, we might have a lot of issues with the word salience. I don't think we're going to fix the assault that's happening on the term of materiality or the interpretation of materiality by omitting that term or by writing our way around it. And also, I don't think we're going to reinforce a more traditional or a more GRI-centric interpretation of materiality by embedding it in this particular disclosure. So I think that we may be trying to do too much with the language here, protecting our interpretation of materiality and making sure that the disclosure is clear and avoiding the word salience and making sure that everybody is on the same page. We may be trying to climb too tall a mountain and writing around things that could be more clearly stated, as Judy said. I think the way that I read 5B4 is, I think, needlessly vague.
Before, if this is important, this phrase right here, why wouldn't we put it sort of just for every topic? That is, as I read through a lot of sustainability reports, there's big topics often that just aren't covered that you would say they meet that criteria. You know, a company in that industry ought to report on that particular issue. And so I guess it's my concern on this is, if it is a good thing to do, why aren't we kind of doing it in general rather than specific to human rights?
Yeah, and I think we should in this context. I mean, this is a concept that was discussed, and the group in their recommendation within their mandate, within their framing of human rights, they have produced this recommendation. For us to take a step back, and also in light of the sector program, the ambition of that program is actually to produce, based on authoritative references, the list of topics that you would expect to be reported as a reference point. And I think we had earlier today the question, what of this will be required? Part of the answer could be, well, you've looked at this and you explain as part of your reporting, if you're not actually identifying one of the listed topics as material to your organization, you explain why, which would be responsive to this and generically across all topics, probably fulfilling the expectation that this recommendation gets at. So, but this is also where the contents come together, and why we're proposing to discuss it also in light of the universal standards more generically. Some of these things have wider application than just for the human rights related topics. But because I think the symptom that we're trying to cure, that certain things are just completely omitted, while it's blatantly obvious that you would organizations at least to want to acknowledge the issue, not to say that they necessarily have to have a way of managing it, but sustainability reporting should actually lead them to acknowledge them and start to deal with the issue.
Dwight.
A couple of responses to some of the things that have been said. One is following up on Bastian, if you do generic due diligence or if you incorporate this into the management approach, you're dealing with the first step of due diligence by identifying where you begin. And it would go beyond human rights to the environment and things like that. So that would be true. I think the concern in the committee was the number of things that would have to be reported, and so they wanted to limit it to the most severe, and that's a way of limiting things if you have the most severe. But the problem is that is the second step. You have a prior step that looks at the common things. So the question is, do you do the first step or do you begin with the second step? The committee thought because of this idea of having too many things that you start with the second step. But then again, it's very hard to you have the expectation. For instance, if you had a company that was marketing clothing, and you read their report, and they talked about the internet freedom, but they didn't mention the labor practices in their supply chain, you would want to know why. And now maybe they have a good reason for not talking about that. Maybe they dealt with it. So the mining example is great. If you get a sustainability report from an extractive company, one of the standout human rights issues is the rights of indigenous peoples. Now, you would expect that to see something there, even if there wasn't a problem. Let's say the company had a policy or the company just did not have any operations that affected indigenous people, so therefore there was no severe impact. But wouldn't that be something that should be reported on? Now, the whole issue is also, as somebody said, who defines these things? The experience at the OECD, where you had companies and unions and civil society and governments, when they did some of the sector-specific work, there was no real disagreement or controversy over what the big issues were in these sectors. I mean, I sat in on the garment and footwear discussions, and this was not controversial. There were many controversies, but what the big issues were for human rights and this and that in the sectors. And then when you have the sector supplements, you can then come up with sort of mandatory disclosures of issues that were agreed upon by a multi-stakeholder thing that might supplement this sort of thing or influence that. But I think that. And then one final comment on the materiality. I'm not in favor of changing the concept of materiality or the word. I think the word is an important word. It's used wrongly by people that ought to know better, but materiality is determined always by the purpose of the report. When you go to a court and you say the whole truth and nothing but the truth, you're talking about materiality, and it's obviously in the context of what the subject is. Does omitting it give a false impression? And now that's materiality, and the issue is, I think, an education issue. Because the education for the GRI, it's not a peculiar interpretation by GRI. GRI is using the word correctly. The problem is people are forgetting the purpose of the report, and so therefore it's incumbent upon GRI not to change the definition of materiality, but to remind reporters and report users what the purpose of the GRI report is.
Other views on this? Okay, I'm not 100% clear where we've landed. Laura, yeah.
I just wanted to respond to a point that Kent made about why not making B4 also relevant for any other topics. So disclosure 5, it's due diligence. It's the first step of due diligence. So if we go ahead with making the due diligence applicable to other areas, this could potentially become also a requirement that you ask about any of the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, just to clarify that.
Thank you for that. Right. Yeah, Gustavo.
Yeah, so about the materiality issue, I think that in this case it's like a mix, because we found some companies that use the materiality in different ways. GRI is clear that the materiality is what you have to report, but some companies have their materiality analysis of what they should manage. So I think in that case there is sometimes it's like a gap between they have to manage and what are reporting, as someone says. But in this case it's like more like an assessment or a materiality analysis for what to manage human right. So it's like a contradict or quite mixed about the materiality meaning here. So it's quite confusion. For example, in the B Corp impact assessment, impact assessment, they talk about materiality and reference to GRI, but in a way of materiality as issue management, not to reporting. So we have to continue thinking in which direction we have to push the materiality analysis. No? That's all.
Okay, so maybe what we should do is go to the proposed next steps and the discussion questions, Laura. I think it's the slide after this one would be, the slide does not want to advance. It's been doing this every so often during the day today. There we go. Proposed next steps. So what the technical committee has asked, or actually I don't know if this came from the technical committee or from the standards division, that as part of the Universal Standards Project, we test the proposed changes to the principles and the terminology, and we identify any additional changes to the principles and terminology through additional research and engagement. Has the discussion we've just had lent weight to this proposal, or has it influenced anybody's views as far as this proposal is concerned? How do people feel about the specific proposal as regards these issues as part of the Universal Standards Project? Dwight.
Yeah, just to clarify something, I think the technical committee proposed changes to these terms which for reasons relating to their mandate. And I think they all make sense and they've been explained. From the point of view of the GSSB, the idea, I think, if you open up the universal standards, you're not just going to open it up for incorporating the human rights stuff. You have some of this other stuff, such as due diligence generally, that the technical committee did. But I think the idea was also, and this is beyond the remit of the technical committee, was to look at some of these other elements of the reporting principles and things like this that were not necessarily dealt with by the technical committee. You know, I know that, for instance, there are problems associated with some of the other reporting principles, such as, for instance, just to throw one out by way of example, sustainability context, which is, I don't think, a very useful principle, but I'm not saying that because of the technical committee, but basically that would be something you would want to have done, is to look at all of those principles if you were opening it up. But I think some of that goes beyond the technical committee.
Yep, absolutely. Kent, I see you.
Yeah, so that comes down to my actual question, which the question is this important enough at this time to bring this up versus, you know, prioritizing wise versus, you know, other things that we've decided not to do, sector analysis, something like that. You know, that for me, that's the whole issue. I think that we should review materiality, and despite the fact that they continue to do it in financial reporting, something good comes from doing it. But I'm concerned about, you know, limited staff and priorities, and whether this is, you know, I agree with what Dwight said, is, you know, then we need to do the whole review, and is this the right priority with the resources that we have?
If I were to put that another way, or would it be fair to flip that around and say, if the GSSB in its wisdom were to say, thank you for your suggestions, but no, we're not going to make these proposed changes, what does that do to the remainder of the human rights project? Is that a fair implication from what you're asking, or?
Well, others could respond to that. You could say, you know, we intend to respond to this, but we're going to take it into consideration along with other things at the appropriate time when it rises to the level of priority. We're not, you know, we're not ignoring it at all. We just have to prioritize it along with all the priorities that we have. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to say, no, we're not going to address it. Say, absolutely, we're going to address it, but we're going to address it in a time frame and with respect to the priorities, that we have in place.
Dwight.
Well, obviously the GSSB can decide its priorities, but in fact, in this area, the GSSB already decided that this was a priority. That's why they created the technical committee, and they looked at the problem of underreporting in the social area. They looked at the emerging instruments and work internationally with respect to, you know, the IFIs, the OECD guidance, and this and that, and there was a certain urgency towards getting the human rights stuff and getting the guiding principles stuff correct and now because of finishing this work up. So there was that as a priority. Of course, you can change your mind, but I think if you're looking at the limited things that you can do with the capacity, you've already invested in a technical committee that has spent a lot of time and presumably resources coming up with these recommendations. And I think that what you would want to do is, however you want to act on them now, because that would be a more efficient use of resources than this and that. And of course, if you open something up, it would only make sense to look at the other things, which is presumably the idea of having a group of the GSSB look at the whole universal standards and see whether, you know, how things might be modified or changed, because there's only so many times you can float a proposed change in a standard. There's only so many opportunities to do that. So I think that would be, you know, just to respond to the priority question of how to do it. But I have no doubt, and certainly the technical committee would agree with me, that the urgent thing for the GRI is to get these concepts in the guiding principles nailed down in reporting in some way, and to bring the human rights stuff up to speed so it's with other reporting frameworks.
I think what I was asking the question around was the specific recommendations around the principles and terminology, not the whole project of reviewing the human rights disclosures. I mean, I think...
No, I'm talking about the universal standard, yeah.
Right. Okay. Evan.
Well, now Dwight has actually made me rethink my position after I flipped my card, because he makes good points. But I don't think that when we voted to push the human rights standard development forward, we didn't think there's no less sense of urgency now. I think that we do feel like we need to facilitate more social reporting, especially in this topic area. I think that what Kent is pushing back on is we didn't necessarily vote to open up the revision of the universal standards themselves, which this seems to sort of require. And, you know, is there a way to push forward on a disclosure standard for human rights that doesn't necessarily require that other chunk of work that may derail a lot of other priorities that we have right in the queue?
So we will have more time to also discuss the scope of the Universal Standards project, and I think that that's definitely in order, because it is probably a question of how do we define the scope. So carrying over the core concepts and the work of the technical committee can be done in different ways and to different extent. And then next to that, the question is how much cleanup work you want to do beyond that within the universal standards is almost a second question. There are, I think, some things that if you were to, on the disclosure level, introduce changes, this would be at odds with guidance that we're giving on the principle level. And notably also that in materiality, that stakeholder notion where you need to have a look. But this can be narrowly defined or broader, and then you look at things like sustainability context and so on. And I think that is something that we want to declinate through with you, so that moving out of this meeting, we can at least prepare the scenarios with the different repercussions and also give you an overview of what would be impacted. But listening to the members, I think there is a certain level of discomfort with that notion that we are basically opening up everything, right, based on the. I think that's fair to say at this stage.
Kirsten.
I think it's very good that a technical committee or other kind of task force appointed by the GSSB suggests things that go beyond the scope of the task they have been given. But there shouldn't be any immediate acceptance that everything that is being suggested should be put on the GSSB table to have consequences further on. But I'm very happy to discuss suggestions, such suggestions, but we can't really go for everything that is being suggested based on the limited resources we do have. But as was said by somebody, that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it, but the timing must be taken into consideration, and when the time is right and it fits in, for sure, it's relevant to look into it, but it's not necessarily this year.
I feel like we have begun to move into the discussion of the universal standards proposal, and I wonder if we shouldn't just officially do that, and then see where we are, having gone through that. Does that sound okay? Okay.
I think the only question is that we didn't get to the end of this. So there's discussion number 3.
Oh, I beg your pardon. You're quite right. We didn't. You're quite right. We didn't do that. So can we then park discussion number 2 for the sake of getting through discussion number 3 and then on to the universal standards discussion? Would that be all right? Yeah. Okay. Right. Laura, if you would be so good as.
Thank you. And I think we can cover this discussion very quickly because, again, we don't require a discussion from you, and we have a specific proposal for what to do next for you to comment on. So the last topic for discussion is on the development of topic-specific standards on human rights. So if we look at the disclosures developed by the committee again, in this scenario, companies would do disclosures 1 till 4, which cover the general approach to human rights. Then they would do disclosures 5 and 6 for each material topic. And then, as you know, in GRI, we also have a number of topic-specific standards that relate to human rights. And in fact, there are many existing topic standards that could be human rights related, but these ones listed here from 406 to 412 are the topics that GRI has traditionally classified as human rights related when we used to have a human rights subcategories in the GRI guidelines. Now, given that the same expectations apply for managing any human rights topic, and that is that the company identifies, prevents, mitigates, and accounts for how it addresses human rights impact, so that's disclosures 5 and 6. And given that, based on an initial assessment from us, we saw that most of the contents in the topic standards are in a way already captured in disclosures 5 and 6, so the overlap is quite big. We asked the technical committee whether additional disclosures, in addition to 5 and 6, would be needed to ensure meaningful and complete reporting on a topic. So the committee discussed this issue at length, and ultimately it didn't reach a unanimous recommendation on whether to have or recommend having additional disclosures in addition to the ones that the committee has already developed. There were a number of arguments for and against this, which are described in quite some detail in item 7. But just to give you a few examples, those in favor of having topic-specific standards or additional disclosures suggested that that could make reporting on a topic much more clear and relevant, and that for some topics, you do need additional disclosures to be able to understand the company's performance in that area and how specific expectations codified in norms, for example, by the ILO, are put into practice by companies. Those against the development of additional disclosures and standards suggested that what the committee has put together is already enough. It's challenging enough as it is, and developing additional standards and disclosures would only add to the burden for companies. They were also concerned that having prescriptive reporting requirements, particularly of quantitative nature, could lead to a tick-the-box approach and could even motivate distortion of performance. And they also added that for most human rights issues, it is very difficult to identify valid indicators of performance. There was, however, strong support for the development of optional reporting guidance on human rights issues. So the disagreement was really with the development of standards and requirements on human rights. They also agreed that in any case, GRI standard 412 on human rights assessment should be deleted, as the contents will be superseded by the new disclosures. The committee also noted that the existing topic standards on human rights are not useful in conjunction with the disclosures that the committee has developed. They have overlapping contents, and in some cases, the contents may be at odds with the approach taken by the new disclosures. So the committee recommended that the disclosures be either deleted or revised, depending on the GSSB decision to have topic standards going forward. Finally, some committee members suggested that some human rights, for example, collective bargaining, freedom of association, and non-discrimination, are universally relevant to most companies, and they are also enabling rights for many other human rights. And they suggested that those topics could be included as mandatory disclosures in GRI 102, the General Disclosures Standard. However, this was not supported unanimously by all the members in the committee, and there were also different opinions as to which specific human rights would be universally relevant and enabling rights. So to summarize the feedback that we have received from both GSSB members and the Stakeholder Council, feedback from one GSSB member indicates that without the inclusion of topic standards, the human rights disclosures developed would be incomplete because achievements and outcomes would not be measured. And the Stakeholder Council, and again, whether this is unanimous agreement or not, it's to be clarified with the Stakeholder Council, but they indicated that there is not agreement to removing the human rights topic-specific standards, and there is concern that this approach might be unclear and result in a decreased focus on human rights issues. So our proposed next steps is to first do a more detailed assessment of the existing topic standards against the new disclosures to really understand how much of an overlap there is and how much of the content will become obsolete when we publish the new disclosures. And then, as suggested by the committee, and this is something that the GSSB has already discussed in the past, would be to develop criteria to identify which topics need the development of a topic-specific standard. And that could be human rights related topics, but also any other topic that the GSSB may want to consider for inclusion in the GRI standards. So we would look to develop criteria for which topics warrant the development of a standard, but also criteria for which topics may be better covered through the development of optional reporting guidance. The committee has suggested some criteria already. For example, that the topic has been sufficiently codified into norms, or that the topic is regulated. So we would look to develop some criteria to bring to you for discussion later in the year. And once there is an agreed criteria by the GSSB, we would then look to apply that to the existing topics and make a recommendation for them to be either revised, deleted, or made guidance. And similarly, we would consider any new human rights topics that may need to be added to the set of standards. So that's the proposal presented to you for comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Discussion.
Invite Dwight to add anything else from the perspective.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I won't take much time. There's a very accurate account of the discussion in the TC. Nobody was happy with the existing human rights standards. And then there's the problem is if you have in the guiding principles all of the human rights and then the companies need to understand them, it's sort of counterintuitive that you then have some and not others, and then that becomes impossible because there's so many others. There was something like this that I referred to earlier in the developments of supply chain codes of conduct for labor practices, which were very prevalent in the late 90s and the early 2000s. They focused on what the ILO called the fundamental rights at work, which was, child labor, discrimination, collective bargaining, and this and that. But what happened is this meant that all of these other things didn't get dealt with by labor, and there was, a whole dimension that was not covered, and so there's that problem. I would suggest two things for this work for the Secretariat. One is to look at the validity of some of these indicators, especially the quantifiable ones, to see if they actually capture what the intention is, because so many of them are, the quantifiable ones are just not valid. There are certain quantifiable ones that are. It's very possible to deal with issues such as discrimination with hard figures. You can have hard figures about pay, hard figures about ethnic groups and this and that. You can sort of capture that. But so much of this other stuff is very hard to capture in a way, certainly in a way that's comparable, and without providing a lot of context. So I think that. And then I just have to note one thing. What there was a lot of support for labor in terms of what might be kept. That was the one category of topics that was the least controversial in terms of keeping, and I just for some reason felt obliged to say that.
Thank you very much, Gustavo.
Yeah, I only want to say that these human rights topic standards, they had two positive impacts in the companies regarding about the supply chain, because in somehow, especially to companies that are in the global compact, they push them to work with their suppliers in human resources. So I don't know if the human resource topics are the correct ones in these topics, but the way that these standards push the companies to improve in these aspects, I think is very positive. I understand that the standards are used to report, to inform, but sometimes the companies uses as a guidance, as something that a good practice, I don't know, guidance. So I see a lot companies improving about their supply chain impact in your human resources. So I don't know if these standards should be stay, eliminated, or change, I don't know. But we don't have to lose that improvement to the companies. That's all.
Some people remember that when in the days of the Technical Advisory Committee, when we were looking at when we were doing the transition from the G4 guidelines to standards, we did consider at one point doing away with the economic, environmental, and social categories, because there are some, what we now call topic-specific standards, which were sort of artificially narrow because of this distinction between economic, social, and environmental. You know, there's the sort of product environmental, these types of things, because in fact in the G4 guidelines, some of these bits of the guidelines were brought together in a way that wasn't specific to one category or the other, but the way that the standards were constructed, it required us to do this. We thought there was some merit in considering, should we do away with those categories? And we decided not to, because that signposting was just considered too important for reporters as a sort of a frame of reference for them to understand this. And I wonder if there isn't actually some merit just to the fact that we have these human rights related topics listed makes them visible to reporters in a way that they might be less visible if they're sort of implied, or they fall out of a deeper review of the totality of human rights and the process for managing them, which is not to say that they wouldn't be there. But I would say, as somebody who works with reporters regularly, shortcuts are extremely helpful, just for awareness, just for understanding at a very basic level. And I think there might be a perverse consequence to eliminating them, which is not to say that I'm opposed to it. It's just that I think let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater with that one. That'd be my view. Kirsten.
I haven't really thought about it in that way before you now mentioned it, but that has happened a few times since the standards were issued, that I get a question, is this or that topic, has it been taken out of GRI? And then, no, it hasn't. It's become a general disclosure. And then, oh. So I really think that is an important issue, and that supports what we have been discussing earlier on, to have some absolutely very important information or reporting requirement included in the general disclosures, and then let the rest stay as a reporting standard.
Michel.
It does not happen often, but I will sound a bit different than Kirsten here. In my opinion, human rights isn't a topic in the way GRI addresses topics. So I would feel more comfortable to see it, let's say, better presented or more obvious, or attract attention on it in the general disclosures, even if it was a specific general disclosures, and that topics which relate to human rights would be updated to include that connection. Just to show how it makes it more complicated than you can think, we're a chemical company. For us, some environmental topics linked to human rights, because if there is an accident in a plant, we have to be sure that vulnerable populations around, like elderly people, schools, or so on, are correctly addressed in emergency preparedness.
Jennifer.
I wanted to, I guess, endorse your comment, Judy, from the perspective of a reporter. If the approach moves to the disclosure being identify the topics and report on them, is much more challenging for reporters than here is an identified list of topics. I think typically the way reporters and companies will do that materiality assessment, for good or bad, is to use the list of topics in the GRI as a checklist to say, is this material, is this material? And very few are included that are not on that list. I know we have one that we've identified as a material topic that is not listed. So I think for the ease and really will lead to more comprehensive reporting if they are left as options to choose, rather than, here you go, please identify your own. Yeah.
Robin.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify from the technical committee. So they were sort of saying you need to do a topic-specific standard for a really long, exhaustive list of human rights, or not at all. And my second question was, how do we currently position safety in relation to human rights topic standards as well?
I'm glad you asked that for two reasons. The secret reason is it's an opportunity to say something that I had omitted from my original presentation, which was about severity, but it's directly in response to your severity as a concept in the guiding principles. It makes it clear that it's relative. And what is it relative to? It's relative to the other impacts of the company. It's not relative to other human rights. See, the danger is that people will say, well, you know, nobody got killed, and that's the real severe human right. I mean, the worst human right that can happen is violation of human right is death. So everything else, we'll deal with the ones where you get killed, and if nobody's getting killed, we won't deal with it. That's not the way it works. The way it works is severity is you've got a bundle of negative impacts. You choose the most severe actual or potential from that bundle that is related to your company. It's not, you know, we're going to cut off things at death or dismemberment or physical harm or this or that. That's the second. And the other thing about that is irremediable makes something severe. So say in my country where people are dismissed and discriminated against because they want a union, the purpose of doing that is to prevent unionization, so to prevent the whole realization of that right. So once you dismiss people and discriminate against them, it effectively denies that human right to others, and so it becomes irremediable within the context of specific workplaces, and that's a very common thing. That's a violation of a human right when that happens. Now, my point is about severity is that it's all relative to what the company is doing to prioritize its own negative impacts, adverse impacts. So I think that partially answers your question. Can you remind me the real question? Because I wanted to answer that too.
No, the first question was the technical committee sort of saying it was an all or nothing sort of thing. We either have to sort of develop a topic-specific standard for each one, or jettison the lot that we've got at the moment.
I don't think that was the sense. The severity thing was what was taken into account, that you can't report everything. It's too long and this and that. There was an understanding, though, by every member of the committee that while you don't report everything, you certainly have to address everything that's an adverse impact that you cause or contribute to. So there's a difference between what a company should do and what a company should report, you know. And I think sometimes one of the problems with reporting is companies only want to report what they do, but sometimes they have to report what they don't do at all. Meaning the whole idea of due diligence is something that occurs before a decision, whether it's transactional due diligence and you're entering into an investment thing. You do the due diligence before you make the decision. And human rights due diligence isn't different that way. The idea is if you're going to, say, start a new product line, and you're choosing to do something that's, say, labor intensive, you might need to figure out the cost of doing due diligence in order to make the decision as to whether you do that. And so if due diligence leads to decisions, and those decisions include not to do something, well, how do you report on that? And so therefore, it's not totally outcomes. It's in this case, you're actually reporting on how you inform a decision and what kind of governance your company has, which doesn't result. So those are two things I needed to say to get off my chest, and thank you for the question.
Laura.
Just to respond to your question, Robin. So I think the proposal to develop this criteria is a recognition that it's not an all or nothing question. It's more about looking for which topics it makes sense to have a standard and prescriptive reporting requirements. So one of the reasons that I haven't covered why some members were against having topic-specific standards is because we would be elevating some rights over others, and that was a key concern from members. But there are some suggestions in the recommendations on how to overcome those risks.
Okay, thank you. Process check and a timing check. What we've decided to do, or what I'd like to propose to do, is that the Universal Standards Project discussion is going to require some time for us to get through, and probably some nice fresh minds. And so I would propose to do that in the morning, but once we have closed out this part of the discussion, to return to the two approvals that we didn't complete earlier on today, so that we can close out the day with those approvals. Does that make sense, everybody? Everyone happy with that? Okay. All right. Can I just check, where are we then with discussion number 3? And also acknowledging that we parked discussion number 2 to be sort of considered alongside the Universal Standards Project discussion tomorrow. Do we have any other feedback for the Standards Division with respect to the proposed next steps on this subject? Okay. Well, it looks. Thank you very much. I think that this has been an extremely useful discussion today. All right. Good. So, if there's no further debate with respect to what we have left to do today, then I guess we can just go back to those two.
Yes. And we tackle the waste first.
Approvals. If we go to we go to the waste disclosures.
So slide 32. Might be easier on the computer.
Now, in order to be fair to the discussion and to the approval that needs to be done here, I would like to acknowledge that Tony Moe was not, unfortunately, able to be part of the discussion this morning, and I just wanted to give him an opportunity to raise any concerns or questions that you have, Tony, with respect to the waste exposure draft standard, just to ensure that we, when we call the question on approval for public exposure, that we haven't missed anything out. No. Okay, thank you very much. Well, that's easy. Right, okay, well then, if we have a quorum in the room, which I believe we do now, I'll ask the question as to, does the GSSB approve the exposure draft standard of GRI 306 waste, subject to any changes discussed today? I don't believe we made changes as such, did we? No. No. Anyone object or abstain or any discussion? Hearing none? Then that's approved, thank you. And the second one, remind me again, is the...
It's the project proposal for
oil
and gas.
Oil and gas and coal, yes. While we're finding the appropriate slide, Tony, I'm going to ask the question again with respect to the oil and gas and coal sector project proposal. Did you have any concerns or specific questions that you wanted to raise?
No.
Thank you. Very good. Okay, does the GSSB approve item 5, project proposal for an oil, gas and coal sector standard? Any concerns or questions remaining? Hearing none, then that is now approved. Thank you very much. Good. Is there... Say that again, Gustavo. The draft of the last session. Oh, I beg your pardon, you're quite right. You're talking about the meeting record from the 7th of February. Yes, we missed that one as well. We have to approve the meeting minutes from our 7th of February meeting. Tony, have you got any edits or questions?
No.
Good. Right. Well, I don't have it in front of me, but does the GSSB approve the meeting summary? It is the 7th of February. I got that date right, didn't I? 7th of February meeting record. Any questions or discussion? Hearing none, that is also approved. Okay, thank you. We're on track. Thank you for the reminder. Okay. Well, that means that we're now sort of back on track with just sort of a quick summary of our day one discussion. If we turn back to the agenda from the start of the day and we sort of think about what it is that we have been, that we set out to do this morning and what we have been able to do, we've gotten through a lot of material actually today, quite a wide range of discussion subjects. And I think you'll all agree that the three different sort of parts to the output from the Human Rights Technical Committee, the findings and the next steps and implications, is all quite challenging. I mean, there are some quite significant choices to be made there. We have not been able to get on to a proper discussion of the Universal Standards Proposal project, but a lot of the other discussions have actually had an impact on what will go into that discussion tomorrow. Am I now looking at the... this is what we have proposed already as the agenda for tomorrow, but it seems to me that we need to update it, don't we? Just help me out here. I'm not sure what I'm looking at here.
No, so this is for
this is
tomorrow.
the okay. Has this now been updated with?
No, we have the first session anyways tomorrow and 120 minutes. On
yeah,
the
of course.
So we will subsume
we did.
The discussion that we had scheduled now for the last session today into tomorrow's first session.
Okay.
A substantive session. So from 9:15 to 11:15, and if it requires a bit more time, that should be possible, and we can accommodate that in the schedule.
Okay. Okay. Good. Any concerns about that? I mean, I think the 2 hours probably ought to suffice. She says, crossing her fingers, but I think I agree. We ought to be able to fit that in tomorrow. Right, and then that leaves for the remainder of tomorrow. We'll have an executive session. We've got a number of administrative and internal sort of things for information only. And then after lunch tomorrow, we have the main item is to look at the GSSB work program going forward, where we stand right now with respect to what we have already identified as projects and things that we want to accomplish in the future, and how we need to consider our timeline and sequencing in order to take advantage of whatever opportunities we can find in the near and midterm future. Any questions or discussion about that? Okay, if that's the case, then I think we could probably close the public meeting for today. Thank you all for your participation, and thank you to those of you who might be listening. And we will convene with the public meeting again at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning.